10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and here we go. Hello folks, it's good to see you. It's bright and early Monday morning again. We are carrying on with our Zorn palette, and I am looking forward to getting some paint on. It is still early, but I got my coffee and I'm all good to go. Alright, so here we go. Now, I will warn you, I'm using a slightly different rig this time. I'm still trying to get something that's going to give me the image quality I'm looking for, and I'm hoping that this is a step in the right direction. We'll see. And I'm also hoping that it is not it's not going to die on me, because this camera is actually running off of battery. I can't hook it up to run off of a regular power supply, I don't believe. So it's gonna be interesting. We'll see if it lasts out the live stream. If it doesn't, my apologies in advance. So we are kicking things off with a look at highlighting and shading these pieces. Most of the surfaces are currently a pretty flat color. The armor, the cloaks, the boots are all going to get this shading and highlighting treatment this week, and I'll spend some time doing that on the live stream. I'll wrap it up after the stream, and then we will get to the non-metallic metals next week, and that will take us through to the end of this series. So with that, I'm going to probably go back, do a little bit of reconsidering how everything works out, how we're all aligned, and then come back in with the next stream the week after, maybe at a different time, certainly with a different project, one I'm pretty excited about. So let's see how this goes. We are gonna start off, I think, with these leather boots. Let's just start at the bottom and work up. So what we want to do is we want to try and get somewhere close to where we were with the original color, and then brighten it a little bit. And I think there's a little tiny bit of black in there to desaturate. A lot more oak than that. More flow going on, so that looks a little bit darker than what we had, which is actually useful. We've got to do a little bit of shading of these as well. So let's start out by doing, shouldn't be too important. The application is what we're going to be focused on. So that is going to be the most comfortable angle. So apologies for the camera in motion as I go. Okay, so we're just kind of lining this into the recesses. It's going a little wider than I want, so I'm going to come back in with just a slightly damp brush and wipe away the excess application before it has a chance to dry on there. Do the same thing for this lower area and around the boot. I'm actually probably gonna just darken up the whole boot considerably. The sole of the boot, sorry, I should say. So here we go. If you're hanging out in the chat, do jump in, let me know what you've been working on. I am always excited to know what other folks have been dealing with and battling and enjoying, whatever it is for you in your hobby journey. I'd love to hear about it, so throw that up in the chat if you are so inclined. Alright, so there we go. This is almost pure black at this point, honestly, but it's just really to kind of give the sense that the shoes end and they don't just kind of puddle into the floor, because that's not really the look we're going for. The other thing that I will be doing is non-metallic metal on this kind of mark of Chaos Undivided on the flooring, so I can just block that out in black to begin with. And there we go. I've honestly not ever been a particularly big fan of Chaos Undivided and Corn, because I feel like Chaos Undivided often ends up just being quite like Corn. A lot of the time I don't really get much of a flavour difference between the two. And honestly, I was kind of dreading painting up this particular warband because it just didn't excite me or inspire me. And you know, especially as a commission painter, you do sometimes get that experience where you're just like, I know I have to paint these models, but I'm really not that excited about it. And sometimes you just have to power through. But for these models, I think having the idea of using the Zorn palette, having something else about the painting project that was a challenge, that was exciting to me, really gave me a reason to want to do these models a lot more than I had otherwise. And I think that's you know, a great way of going about it. If you've got models, you know, maybe you just that one particular unit for your army that you really need to have, but you kind of dread painting it. Having something like that, whether it's a limited palette or a new style you're trying, maybe you're going to try wet blends on it, something like that. If you do it on a model that you're not desperate to paint, but you know you kind of need to, it gives you a motivation for painting it, and it gives you an excuse if it doesn't come out so well either. You know, I think it's a good idea just to challenge yourself a little bit, right? And that way you've got some other element of the project that excites you, even if it's not the models themselves. And yeah, it's you know, you could just as well say, well, why the hell are you painting a model that you're not actually excited about painting? You know, I have all of the Warhammer Underworld warbands. I've painted most of them. I did get a few back when I first started that were painted by somebody else, and for the most part I've left those ones. But it's you know, it's just when I have I want to have the set fully painted so that I enjoy playing with them, because I really don't much care for playing with unpainted models. It just doesn't feel right to me. Even with board games, I paint a lot of the models that I have in board game sets. So, all right, got a little sidetracked there. Went off on a Chaos Undivided icon sprint, but let's get back to our shading of these boots. So obviously these kind of wrinkles under the folds of the boot are also going to be a little bit shaded. And then the other area where we're going to be working on this is the inside of the foot, which obviously is not getting nearly as much light. This was very clear back on the Zenithal stage, and actually ironically, because it didn't get as much paint, it's quite desaturated on the inside of the foot, so this should help fix that a little bit as well, so that it doesn't look just pasty. I'm going to try a slightly different angle for the lighting, see if we can brighten things up a bit without completely wrecking the lighting balance. Let's find out. Whew, boy, that is bright. Let's halve it and see where we're at. That's a little bit better. So, a little bit of a distorted image. Let's see if I can do anything about that. just angle that one down a bit and just try and block some of that light and bring in the light a little bit lower and forward so that it's above me and brightens the screen a little bit. And let's have a look. So properties. I honestly think about half of my problems are that I insist on painting on a wooden table, and it really messes with the colours. That's a little bit closer to what I am seeing, so hopefully that is helpful to you all. So back to the boots, and we've got a little tiny bit more shading to go just on the inside of this boot. Shade that down a little bit more. Actually going to go all the way to pure black for this bit here, because this is visible but very clearly in a heavy shade. Okay, now it's time to highlight, and highlighting leather is one of those things that I enjoy far too much. It's a very quick and very satisfying effect that you can achieve. So here we go. I'm going to just mix out my highlight color here. Let me actually put the tiniest hint of red into this. I think I've probably thinned that a little too much. Try and build it back out again. So instead of, I'm just taking a lot of the moisture out of my brush, but trying not to lose too much of the pigment. Instead of just doing edge highlights like you would normally, what you're going to do is just gently tap down somewhat irregularly along that edge. Try and vary the pressure, the size of those placements. Too much moisture on this brush, so just wick that away. I'm just going to start from scratch here with this blend. So overdid it with the red. So highlighting leather is a combination of two things. You've got your natural light highlight, which is what you would expect to see on any surface from light reflection, right? And the reflectivity of a surface is variable, right? If you think about just taking leather on its own as an example, if you compare, shined leather, think of army boots so shiny you can see your face in, versus like a leather strop for sharpening a razor, or really worn leather that's kind of fibrous and you can almost see the hairs of it. The amount of light that you get in reflection on each of those is very, very different. The same is true for pretty much any kind of surface. It will have a particular level of light reflection to it. A mirror is much shinier than a rusty sword or whatever. So that is the one side of leather, is just that pure light and dark, and that's going to vary about depending on the style of the leather that we're talking about. The other thing is how worn the leather is, and so the technique I'm using here is kind of a combination of those two things. It's brightening in areas largely where you would expect highlight, but it's also brightening because of wear, and so that means we're going to also kind of put maybe a few thin lines of scuffs and scrapes into the surface of the leather, but for the most part we're going to focus on areas where you'd expect to see a highlight, but probably also expect to see some scuffing and wear naturally, right? The tips of the boots, the fold where it kind of gets, there's a lot of movement and it's having to hold up against that a lot. And we're just using this dabbing mark to vary the consistency of that. Just going to have a second brush on hand to wipe away when I get it on arm panels. Yeah, so we just build this up little by little over time. And I tend to go in with, you know, a couple different shades and colors and do different effects, because you are trying to reflect two different causes for this. So you do want to be mindful that there are going to be different shades. It's also why I brought a little bit more of that red in than just purely brightening up the base color. Got a little bit of scuffing there. Okay, so that's quite, sorry, I don't know how much of that ended up being off camera, my elbow shifted. That is, you know, kind of an initial highlight, and it looks very much like a highlight. So now we're going to go in and we're going to adjust that color a little bit more. We're going to try and shift our palette towards a brown more, still keeping it a little bit light, but more of a different color than we had previously. We're going for a warmer brown. Still very difficult for me to position these colors where I want them to be. Adjust to it. I think we're nearly there. And then we're just gonna take a splodge of white and brighten that up so that we've got a brighter color. So you can see this is very different to that kind of color that we had before. You can't because I'm completely off camera. So this is the mix that we've got now. Very different to this color here. So let's take off the excess. And we're just doing the same thing. Not actually going to go dark with this so that it shows a little bit more. We're not trying to hit everything. We're just trying to pick up some of the textures. And we're mostly focusing this on areas which are going to get more deeper scuffing. It's really kind of hacked into the leather, and we're getting the layer below showing through quite a bit. Okay, I think that will do it. Just going to quickly touch up this bit where I was a little overzealous with my highlighting. Okay, so now let's shade those armor plates. So we're going to take red and black. We're pretty much just using these two colors when we were painting up the armor plates to begin with, so we'll stick with these two, but we'll just introduce a little bit more of the black. Darken that down nicely. Go into all of, oh no, that needs to be darker still. Pick out all of the details that are going to have shade accrue around them. Shade up the back part of this plate further. Same with this plate back here. Okay, we're going pretty dark on these. The underside of all of these little cones needs shading as well. Spiky bits. Alright. And pick out the detailing on the fingers. Whole area here is going to be pretty heavily shaded. Set back under the arm. Hard to get at with the brush, hard to get at with light. Good candidate for some heavy shading. I might even go into full black for some of these areas. I generally, unless I'm using contrast paints, don't really wash very much with my paints. I find it tends to impact the main color, the base coat color, a little too much for my liking, and then you end up losing a lot of the effect just by going back in to rebalance that. So I tend to be pretty precise in my application of shadows, which is a lot slower, but I think I generally prefer the effect when I do. It's not to say you shouldn't use shading or shades. Honestly, it's because I can't predict what that final color is going to look like to my satisfaction to be able to anticipate for it. So I just don't do it. There are very many different ways of getting those shades into place. You've got your your wet blending, you've got your layering, you've got your feathering, you've got your glazing, you've got two brush blending. There's a world of shading options out there. I'm gonna try and get a slightly less aggressive shadow for this piece where it starts to kind of curve underneath a little bit, just a bit. Kind of transition there. Let that dry and see how it comes out. A lot of the shield is pretty much in light actually. It's some profane symbols or something here. Just throw those in. A little bit of a touch up on this area here. Shade that down to match in a bit. One of the reasons for using this quite muted red is it gives us a good place to move to get a really nice bright highlight on it with the paint scheme, the paint set that we have available to us. So the highlights on this will be pretty powerful, especially compared to the other colors available to us. We don't have another really super saturated color. You can get very sharp white highlights, but it doesn't convey quite the same way. Again, getting the super dark shadows in under the arm. This is a hard angle to reach and me to see and you to see, but trust me, it's what I'm doing here. So just going in under there. And we're going to really darken out this area here on this side. A little collateral damage there, fix that up. repair job on the helmet. We can actually just fold that into our highlights a little bit. So we might as well move on to highlights now. And for the highlights, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm literally just going to use the pure Purell red. Now this is quite a jump in value, possibly too sharp of a jump, but that's kind of the effect that I figured I'd go for here. So all of those studs with just the faintest touch on top, it'll pop right away. If you apply too much pressure, you're just going to paint the whole area, which is really not what you're looking to do with that. Brush out the top of the spiky bits. There's a time I actually knew all the names of these different armor plates, and I just don't know what they are anymore. Now, edge highlighting is one way to go with this. The only thing is, because this guy's got, you know, pretty beaten up armor, you're not going to expect smooth, straight edges, so you might want to consider maybe doing a little bit of that same technique that we were using on the boots to make it show as a little uneven, or kind of do some breaks in that edge highlight to show where it's inconsistent. Some spots of highlights. Now notice that I'm not introducing any other color here. I'm not adding white to push it further. Red and white makes pink, and pink is a poor highlight color for red. So if you're gonna do something like that, it won't work with the Zorn palette, but you can use a bright yellow. It will shift it to orange, obviously, but that does look better as a highlight color generally than pink would. So if you don't have quite the brightness that you're looking for, just using a red, that is definitely the way I'd suggest you go. The other thing to remember is when you've got these big scratches, one edge, the upward facing edge, which is usually the bottom edge, is going to be catching a little light there, so make sure that you capture that. And I've drifted completely off camera again, I'm sorry. So, just on those upward facing edges, you just want to run a thin line of red to highlight it up. So just along that edge there. That gives you your high contrast. There's a sharp shape in here. We can go and reinforce the shadow a little bit more. There you go. It really gives the impression that there's been deformation of the actual surface of the metal when you do that. Okay, so there we go. That is a good first pass for the red. I will probably come back and do some more of that in a bit. But for now, let's move on to this cloak. And little secret here, I actually hate painting cloaks. I am not very good at getting the volumes or getting the transitions to a place where I'm comfortable with them. I kind of block it in, and you're dealing with a lot of light values, a lot of degrees of shadow, degrees of highlight with a cloak. You've got big volumes, you've got slow transitions, and this is the challenge for bust painters as well. Those volumes tend to be large, you've got more space to work with, and for me it's a real struggle, in large part because my blending is not very good. I like painting small things because I've got reasonably good eyesight to see it, and I can get away with shortcuts where I'm not really blending. I'm just putting colors next to each other, but because it's such a small space, unless you're right up looking at the model, it's very, very difficult to see that. With cloaks, you don't have that luxury. The volumes are there for you to blend with, and so you have to blend for it to look right. And the other problem is, of course, those light values, and whilst I'm usually okay at seeing that for less organic shapes with the kind of irregularity in the flow of folds, I find it very difficult to identify that given a light source, and making sure that that light source appears consistent across the surface of that fabric. So with all of that said, let's jump back into it and give this a whirl. So I think this will do pretty well for our highlight color. I'll take that as is actually. And one of the cheats that I often use for this is I just kind of sketch in some coarse texturing to mask the fact that I am trying to avoid blending. So if you ever see on one of my pieces that I've got a lot of texturing in there, it's because I'm trying to hide the fact that blending is not my strength. Just like with leather, we're going to have an uneven edge, so we want to tap in those edge highlights, try not to let them roll down onto the surface too much. But if you do, it also happens to look like coarse texturing, so you're not necessarily doing that badly. Highlight for these holes as well in the fabric. Okay. Starting to get a little bit more bullish on our highlights. Remember not to work too much on the same area, or you're going to start tearing up the paint if it's not dried properly. As I mentioned on a previous live stream, I do try and avoid using the hairdryer if I can. We may want to crack it out for just getting a little more progress on this cloak. We'll see. The nice thing with adding this kind of coarse texture is you can do it with different colors, and that effectively becomes your fake blend. So, you know, we can use a more neutral color here. A lot of fabrics like this will actually have weaves of different styles, or threads of slightly different colors, rather, I should say. So you can just kind of build that into what you're doing. Now it's not flawless. You know, it doesn't scale correctly for the scale of models that we're working on. You've got very, very coarse fabric here. So if you were doing, you know, like a silken gown or something like that, this is really not going to cover your ass. But I can't imagine these guys wearing the finest silk, honestly. So, you know, this probably is meant to be animal hide rather than fabric, but it should still work well enough for a little bit of a cheat. So. Don't try not to make your lines too regular. You want them parallel, but you don't want them to kind of start and stop at the. Let's demonstrate on the palette. I'm actually gonna. What am I gonna do? That's a wonderful question, Dev. Okay, I'm gonna just paint it onto the table. Okay, so what you don't want is it starts here, it ends here, 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 right? That suddenly looks like you've got striping on your thing. Even if you kind of cross it off, right, then it starts looking like you've just got a checkerboard on your cloak, right? That is not the result that you're looking for. You want something a little less smooth, so you want kind of like vertical stripes like this, and then your horizontal stripes come in maybe. This. So you've got your kind of, you know, a woven fabric, but it's not quite, it's not regular. You're not seeing every element of the weave, and then if you add in another color across it, you kind of start building up this texture. And you know, maybe the impression I'm giving is that this line is more in highlight, this line is more in shadow, so I'd go back in and I'd reinforce that shadow with maybe a few more crosshairs over here. So we've got, you know, and then we'll build the highlight up a little bit further, and we've got more highlights here. And so you've got that kind of transition from light to dark as you go across the surface. Okay. So those are the kinds of effects that we're trying to reproduce on the surface of this model. So for instance, with the initial highlight color that I've been using, I've kept to the upper surfaces. With this mid color that you can't see on camera, that's at the bottom of my palette, this one here, I'm using it somewhat in the shadows, somewhat in the highlights, all over really. And then I'll go in with a much darker than the actual current shadow color weave to introduce right into the shadowed areas. I'm just going to jump right down to the pure black and throw some pure black texturing in here. This does require brush control, it does require a very fine hand. That's all stuff you get with practice. Don't be afraid to do this. Worst case, you just glaze over it and it mutes it down so much that you barely see it anyway. You know, it's It's a very fun technique, I find. But as I said, I will do pretty much anything to avoid having to blend because I suck at blending. And the reason I suck at blending is because I do anything I can to avoid blending. Uh, this felt like an easier option for me. And so this is what I do, but that's not to say it's what I should be doing. I'm comfortable doing this, so I should go back to blending and practice blending, because you only get better by practice. And I really should work on practicing a more diverse skill set, and yet here I am categorically not doing that. So, you know, do as I say, not as I do, people. It's a good lesson for life. Now, I know from experience that this will dry quite a lot less aggressively dark than it appears currently, but see, I'm not afraid to glaze over the texturing that I already have, just to build up some of that shadowing. Feather it out where it's too aggressive of a transition. Let that dry off. And you can see here already where I applied pure black, it's muted down to a grey as it dried, and a lot of that is because it's drying fairly matte. With black, for some reason, black looks a lot blacker with a gloss finish. You can demonstrate that really easily if you get a rattle can of flat black and a rattle can of gloss black and spray a couple of things. It doesn't have to be minis, you could just spray pieces of cardboard and hold them next to each other. You'll find that that flat black looks and feels like it's grey by comparison. It's just something that kind of happens with the light, that you want that little tiny point of high reflection, that little spark of light to make that black seem that much darker. Okay, so I'm gonna go back over. I'm gonna mask some of this rather coarse texturing that I have on here with some brown to thin it out. And we'll brighten up those highlights a little bit as well. I'm gonna just layer this in. Layering is an excellent technique for acrylics because acrylics dry relatively quickly. Layering is a more viable technique than it is for oil paints, for instance, because you can actually do it if you're waiting a day and a half for each layer of your layering to dry. You're not going to get your piece finished very quickly. Now, an interesting thing about the struggle with blending, and I will be talking about this a lot because it's a struggle for me, but the struggle with blending is not a thing in oil painting because you have so much working time. Traditional art doesn't really think of blends. It's much more focused on the texture of application of the paint, the position of it, the form it takes, the direction of the brush stroke, the shape of that brush stroke, the pressure of it. Those are things that you're thinking about because those form the image. The blending comes completely naturally because you've got hours of working time with these paints. In acrylic painting, you are constantly fighting that drying time. You are having to get your paint down and mixed and shaded and those transitions in place fast enough that the paint's not dried. So that's where the challenge is coming from. It's not a universal to the art world, and it's not as if painting in 2 dimensions you're not applying shadows and highlights to a surface because you're still reflecting three-dimensional things. We're reflecting three-dimensional things on a three-dimensional surface, but we're faking the scaling of the model. And they're faking the entire 3D effect, right? So it is a very different challenge from one medium to another. All right, Dev, enough gassing, back to painting. I heard you all thinking it, loud and proud. I did. So, let's... Just do a few touch-ups here and there. Looks like that highlight is dried out a bit, so we can layer in some more. Go back to my cheating texturing to hide the transitions a little bit. Yeah, you can see I started getting a little bit too regular on that because I was using longer strokes, which destroys the effect a little bit, but we can go back in and kind of break those lines up a bit. So I'm going to pop a little contrast into the holes here. Just pump that black ink to really emphasize those shadows, those recesses. Alright, so starting to get some contrast across the surface of that cloak. It's looking pretty good. Just keep working at it. up some shadows into this loincloth that we have here. Okay. Careful blacklining is a really excellent way of giving a lot more shape and structure to your model, because you're helping tell the eye where one element of the model ends and the next starts, which on models of this scale can be quite tricky for the eye to gauge naturally. And it's another element of that faking that this is a larger piece. When you look at the interaction between small volumes versus large volumes, the shadows created are that much different, and the blacklining is really just, you know, a shortcut to reflecting that shadow transition. And it doesn't have to be black. You can use, you know, a dark brown or a dark purple or whatever makes sense, dark blue, whatever makes sense for your model and the colors that you're positioning it next to. If you're using a lot of warm colors, a dark brown is going to be a lot less disruptive to the eye than using a black will. Okay, got a little bit more to do here. Give that some shape. This is an effect that shades and washes are pretty good at reproducing. Unfortunately, they also stain the surfaces, so you do lose something in doing it that way. But there's always a downside and an upside to any technique. Shading is magical, but it does have its drawbacks. When I say shading, I mean, you know, washing or whatever you want to call it. You know, applying GW shade paints, that kind of an effect. So. Okay, guys, I guess that is the end of the camera. I am going to have to call it there. I did fortunately cover the areas that I'm intending to work on. I'll finish them off for this model and the other models, and we'll come back next week and we'll get to that NMM that I keep taunting you with. So we will mostly be doing silver. I think I identified a couple little pieces that I could go gold with, so we'll try and get a little bit of gold and NMM in there as well. This color palette actually will work pretty well for both of them. The red into the yellow ochre with the white and the black will give us those warm transitions to the warm gold colors. Excluding the red will give us a colder gold, a kind of greener gold, and then the white and black on their own will do a passable job for the steel. Usually I like to introduce a little bit more blue into my steel, but we're going to be at the mercy of how much of a blue tone the black ink is going to give us, which I can tell you from experience is not quite as much as I would like, but it will still work. And the effect of NMM, the high reflectivity, you can do with any set of colors as long as you go from, you know, basically pure black up to pure white. So it's it'll be fun, I hope. I have enjoyed our time together today. I would like to thank you all for watching. If you would be so kind as to subscribe, maybe like this video, maybe put in a comment. I know the chat has been pretty quiet today, but yeah, do those things. That would be much appreciated. If you want to see more of my work in progress, my Instagram account is Raggy Paints. You can check me out there. Drop me a note. Let me know what you think of the YouTube channel, why it's terrible, why it's great, all of those things. But for now, everybody, later days.